Hello, my name is Benjamin Hart. I'm an American attorney and the managing director of Integrity Legal here in Bangkok, Thailand. As can be surmised by the tag on this video, the photo tag on this video, as well as the title, this is something of an opinion piece. As discussed in a prior video, we are taking affirmative steps to go ahead and, in my opinion, and this video kind of strayed a little further from what our usual, in my opinion, our mandate is on this channel. But it initially started kind of right in line with what I view our bailiwick to be here, and then it kind of strayed later as I got to thinking about it. But as I have seen a lot of your feedback, and it looks like, yeah, I will be firing up a channel where I'll talk a little bit more just on my kind of like my opinions, if you want to look at it like that, regarding these matters or regarding what's going on around us at any given time. However, this is really one of the most pressing concerns of the moment, the current situation in Thailand. It pertains to travel, it pertains to immigration, it pertains to just, living here, expat life. So I definitely think it's within the realm of this video. The reason for the title, when I was initially contemplating this video, I was contemplating the following quote from the late President Ronald Reagan on August 12, 1986. And the quote is, quoting directly, "The 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, 'I'm from the government and I'm here to help.'" And I've always found that quote to be rather interesting, and I'm here to tell you those words ring rather poignantly to those, I think, in Thailand at the moment, because I would say that at best there is ambivalence about how the government's been operating the past few weeks. Now, as I'll get into in a little bit, I don't know if some of the negativity toward the government is necessarily fully warranted in the sense that it's even the government's job to have to deal with some of these things. But let's get into that when we get into it. When I talk about the mood of what's going on here in Thailand, I think it's best encapsulated in a recent article I read from the Thai Inquirer, that's thaiinquirer.com. Article is titled, "Opinion, the Summer of Discontent Continues." Quoting directly, "I have written elsewhere on these pages about my contempt for the apathy the Thais have for the political system and how it has, quote, come home to roost, unquote, at a time of national emergency. Not caring about politics and the people that govern us has ensured that we have the worst government seen in decades, managing the country at a time of global pandemic." And you can go into that article and read that again, thaiinquirer.com. Article is, and we'll put that up there. The opinion, the summer of discontent continues. Now, I've read these articles written by the same writer, and there's a lot of interesting thoughts in there. But at least in my personal opinion, when it comes to the apathy Thais have toward the political system that's governing us, I have to say on my part, I'm guilty of that, especially, and let me be clear, within this specific context of COVID. Up until about the last month, I've kind of taken the position of, well, nobody's going to let it get spiral too far out of control. People, it's sort of in the back of my head, it's been, well, the adults in the room will kind of come in and clear things up. Well, clearly that may not be happening, and various ways you can interpret that phrase. But long story short, I completely understand the discontent felt among Thai people regarding the current situation. I, however, have a different take on it insofar as my thinking is the very notion that a government can eradicate a virus to me is like saying 2 + 2 = Albuquerque. It just, one doesn't have anything to do with the other. And quite frankly, in the history of time, it never has. Now, let me be clear in what I'm saying about that with what I think here. Governments instituting a quarantine, for example, on people coming in and out of the country. Yes, clearly there's not only precedent for that, but it's been proven that that can be done and be done effectively by a government, okay? At the same time, dealing with things like setting up a remote hospital. That can be done. That specific task can be done. The notion that the government should or has some sort of mandate or even could conceivably eradicate COVID, to me, seems quite strange. Because my next question is how? How is the government supposed to go about doing that? Like I said, it's like saying, I'm going to do algebra by chewing gum, or I'm going to cut my hair using a snowblower. It just, one is not, doesn't have anything to do with the other. Government's job is to govern. And yes, there are administrative functions. And yes, when this all started, and I've stated this on this video, Thailand took a hard line. They did a proper standard quarantine. They locked out their own citizens from returning to Thailand for a brief period of time. And then they instituted quarantine measures. The government instituted quarantine measures that basically, but those were specific tactical goals. What's sort of been bugging me in this entire narrative between, let's just leave it between the people and the government for the moment, is that the people are really enraged at the government for not fixing COVID. And then the government goes out and does a lot of things in an effort to do this that have unintended consequences that have all kinds of terrible results, or just have direct consequences that have all kinds of terrible non-COVID related results. And meanwhile, cases still go up. We saw a lockdown, the full lockdown last year, and here we are a year later and we're still dealing with this. It's not like it went away. And let's be clear, this isn't just me directing this at the Thai government, the US government, and it's been kind of odd this past month or so, watching Thailand go through this cycle this year. It's been like deja vu because I keep such pretty close tabs on US news. This is what the US was doing last year. And just as for example, a recent article from the Bangkok Post, that's bangkokpost.com, and the article was titled, "Business Baffled by Gaffes." And just to go ahead, and it's a small excerpt, but it just hit me like a ton of bricks. Quoting directly, he said an urgent task for the government is to flatten the curve to prevent the country from facing the same situation as India, which was severely impaired after recording a massive amount of infections. That flatten the curve just hit me like a ton of bricks, because this has just been within the last couple of weeks that I read that article. And I remember a year ago in America, the narrative, and in my mind, 2 weeks to flatten the curve was the narrative. That was the catchphrase. It's going to be 2 weeks to flatten the curve. We're just shutting down 2 weeks. We're going to be reopened, but we need to flatten the curve. Get that curve flattened so the hospitals can handle this and we can all get back to business. 2 weeks to flatten the curve. In my mind, 2 weeks to flatten the curve is going to be kind of the mission accomplished. George W. Bush standing on that aircraft carrier saying mission accomplished about Iraq. It rings the same way in my mind is, oh, well, just 2 weeks to flatten the curve. If it's not outright disingenuous, one would argue it's to levels of naivete, especially in hindsight, that rise to the level of wondering if someone's being willfully naive. So when I heard this, I started thinking about all of this. And at first, this video was going to be about government. And it was going to be about, government versus the people. And as I said, the people get upset with the government that the government isn't, quote unquote, fixing COVID. Then the government sort of flips out and responds by trying to fix COVID. Well, they do it with these mechanisms that, in my opinion, don't make a lot of sense. And we'll get into some of that here in a moment. But the purpose of this video, what it evolved into, is I was sort of analyzing this feedback loop, this people versus the government, and what they wanted, and how they ended up in this kind of negative feedback loop, where there's a certain segment of the population that wants even harsher restrictions, although in my opinion, at this point, there's no real bona fide proof that it's done anything other than wreck the economy. So and maybe reasonable people can disagree. Maybe certain measures need to be implemented and certain measures we could do without. I mean, things like, for example, just the blanket alcohol ban, it just made no sense to me, especially when you allowed dine-in restaurants. I don't know where that thinking came from. But again, it's sort of like the people get angry and then the government feels it needs to be seen, quote unquote, doing something. And so they go out and do something that's not necessarily a good thing. For example, in a prior video we did, we talked about the shutdown of restaurants, the alcohol ban. And I kind of mentioned offhand in that video that, you know, nobody was talking about shutting down construction sites. And, you know, I stated that in that video thinking it was self-evident that no, we have to do a cost-benefit analysis. You can't just shut down construction sites. Well, then turn around within a day or two, they did shut down construction sites. Friends of mine actually brought up to me that they truly believe that they may have done it because I said it. I'm here to tell you, I don't think anybody's listening to me that hard. But the long story short is that ended up having unintended consequences because the government wanted to be seen, I think the government wanted to be seen sort of doing something, and then they shut those down, and then people sort of left them, and there's then been subsequent reports that the virus spread further, which if they would have just been left alone in the first place, presumably those people wouldn't have left those sites to thereby spread the virus. Again, you see this cascading effect of unintended consequences coming from this people-government feedback loop. Now, there's a missing component to that. When I was first looking at this, I was saying to myself, oh, yeah, it's just, you know, it's just this feedback loop. No, there's one other component, and in my opinion, it exacerbates the problem, hence the reason for this video. That quote from Reagan is multifaceted, and it's pregnant with a lot of nuance. Most notably, there's a kind of, especially on the American conservative right, there's kind of an implied belief that there's a hubris in certain government officers that they know better than the common people or something. I always kind of had that feeling that was how the conservative right felt about the government. You can kind of feel it in this quote. But also there's also this simultaneous feeling that they're not so good and they don't exactly know what they're doing or talking about. And that's why you should kind of be terrified if they're coming. It's interesting because on a certain level, I kind of disagree with the quote. There's an author and writer named Chris Hedges who once talked about this quote, and he said, yeah, it's terrifying unless you're a poor person in Camden who needs like assistance. Then maybe the government can help you. And I was thinking about this when thinking about making this video, and that's where I came to this kind of more nuanced hypothesis regarding the government, first of all. And that nuanced hypothesis is the government often can help with specific tasks. Where I get terrified is when the government says we're here to help with some grand scheme, for lack of a better, with just some grand, vague problem, if you will. Like we're gonna tackle COVID. Well, how are you going to do that? You know, if the government comes out and says we're going to do this, we're going to institute this quarantine, okay, that's a set goal, you can see it. When they say we're going to tackle COVID, that gets a little scary because mission creep, and what does that mean? And as we've seen, draconian restrictions, not only economic but social, as a result of this, for lack of a better term, war on COVID. In the American context, we saw a lot of this creepiness in the sort of war on terror, you know, where the government just decided to be at war on fear itself. I mean, that is a pretty vague concept to be at war with, and it led to a lot of quote-unquote mission creep and sort of getting away from really specific goal-oriented tasks. Back to the original point, though, this feedback loop between the people, the government, in my opinion, especially recently, especially with COVID, it's been exacerbated a lot by the media. You know, just either sensationalism or sort of, I'm not going to go out on any limbs and say, oh, they're lying about this or that, but it's sort of just, maybe there's a desire because obviously COVID's the only real thing to talk about right now. Certainly nobody's doing anything of any, you know, yeah, we had this recent explosion here in Thailand. That was terrible. You know, that made front page news. That was the first time COVID wasn't on. I shouldn't laugh. That's not right. But it was the first time COVID was not on the front page that I noticed of the Bangkok Post print edition in 6 weeks, I'm pretty sure. In any event, that was kind of an interlude, and then we've been dealing with just this COVID constantly, sort of all the time in the narrative. The point I'm trying to make is I don't think anybody's acting in bad faith, but the media is out there to get eyeballs and to get likes, to get noticed, to create fanfare, to some degree to sensationalize, and that's their business to one degree or another. And that's been exacerbated a lot in the online era because, the old models of journalism, especially the business models of journalism, have kind of fallen apart, and new models have somewhat taken their place. However, if nothing else is taken away from this video, in my mind, just be careful how we're consuming all this media, and let's everybody just take a breath and try to figure out how to get through this without just exacerbating rancor. And yes, there's certainly accountability that needs to be had, especially on the part of the government. I'm not saying that. There's been major issues, and I'm not going to go into all of them in this video, but most notably, folks I know regarding the vaccine are very upset regarding the rollout of that. Other issues on top of that, a lot of pressure out there. But, now is not really, in my opinion, the time to be pointing fingers. There's a great film that I rather like called Rising Sun. It's based on a book called by Michael Crichton of the same name, Rising Sun. In it, Sean Connery plays a man who was basically an American expat in Japan for a long period of time. He moves back to the U.S. and he works as a police liaison officer with the Japanese community in Los Angeles. And there's a great line where he's talking to another police officer, and he says, the Japanese have a saying, fix the problem, not the blame. Find what's effed up and fix it. That way nobody gets blamed. And when I've been looking at this situation, I kept thinking of that quote the last few weeks. And again, it's the reason for making this video. Let's just stop blaming each other and try to just figure this out and move on. That said, again, I think some circumspection in the media that we consume regarding this and many other topics is definitely a good thing to have. So another article from the Thai Inquirer, that's thaiinquirer.com. This is actually from back in January of 2020. Quoting directly, and this is interesting because this is before the hysteria sort of all caught on around COVID. So I like the analysis in this to some degree. Quoting directly, the title is, Thai media is outsourcing much of its coronavirus coverage to Beijing, and that's just the start. Quoting directly, Thailand's media landscape is currently saturated with news about the coronavirus. Just this week, several people have been arrested or warned about spreading misinformation about the disease. The mainstream media itself is an eclectic mixture of fear-mongering and analysis. That's well put. Quoting further, yet Thais still, to a large extent, trust legacy media institutions that have been around for decades. But if one were to scrutinize further, there may be a reason to place heavy skepticism on news that is shared for everyday consumption. Quoting further, this week, Channel 3 announced a partnership with Chinese state-run Xinhua news agency to broadcast Xinhua coverage on the coronavirus outbreak. Quoting further, with millions of likes on the Facebook page, it's clear that coronavirus isn't China's only viral export. Quoting further, the recent dominance of Chinese media in Thailand is the confluence of two structural dynamics: Thailand's declining news industry and China's growing soft power offensive. Journalism may be suffering globally, but the Thai news industry has exhibited particularly painful symptoms. Of the two English-language dailies in Thailand, The Nation discontinued its print edition in 2019 after losing millions of baht for 5 consecutive years, while the Bangkok Post is selling its buildings to stay afloat. And I really urge folks to go check that out. Thai Inquirer, thaiinquirer.com, titled Thai Media is Outsourcing Much of Its Coronavirus Coverage to Beijing, and that's just the start. And again, I find it interesting that they mention that Thailand's declining news industry, that it's sort of declining. Well, that could be factoring in to why coronavirus is just constant, because it's a known quantity. You know it's going to get noticed if you're a publisher out there. It's a known quantity, so you know you're going to get eyeballs off of it. And if you have declining resources, it may be relatively easier to just stay on that subject rather than go and find new news stories. Just to my mind, that's just my my speculation on where or my inference on where, what may be driving, again, this feedback loop to some extent. Now, the interesting thing about this is I don't want this to get into like a China versus US and the narrative and all of that, because I think that, as noted in that prior video, the fear-mongering is going on across the media. Just as a for example, and again, to go back to 2020, specifically June 2020, if you want to talk about some really strange fear-mongering and from a pretty establishment place in the Western context, this is from the Washington Post, and that's WashingtonPost.com from their website. Article is titled, "Put a Lid on It, Folks. Flushing may release coronavirus containing, quote, toilet plumes," unquote. Quoting directly, "Add this to our list of worries in these anxious times. Coronavirus containing clouds that waft into the air when a toilet is flushed. Scientists who simulated toilet water and airflows say in a new research paper that aerosol droplets forced upward by a flush appear to spread wide enough and linger long enough to be inhaled." You will forgive me if I giggle a little bit at that, and if I also look back again, this is June 2020, so this is a little over a year ago. As I've said, it feels like being in a level of deja vu, or that movie Groundhog Day, having watched all this narrative play out in the US and now seeing it play out over here in Thailand. And the reason I bring this up is, again, nobody out there in the media is innocent. See, in my opinion, it seems to me that many of the major, I shouldn't say nobody, many of the major news outlets across the spectrum, across nationalities, whatever, have been engaged in, look, people get scared. And in June 2020 in America, people were scared. And journalists get scared like anybody else. But again, it becomes part of this feedback loop that doesn't make anything better. It doesn't fix the problem. It just fixes the blame. We all know what's at fault. COVID, it's out there, okay? So moving forward, just to provide, in my opinion, some clarification, this is from the Johns Hopkins University website, and we'll go ahead and put up their web address to these statistics. But this is the COVID statistics by country. This is Johns Hopkins University. I don't know that I can find much more credible data than this. So just as a comparison, Thailand's confirmed cases, at least as of the time of this video, according to Johns Hopkins, of 283,067. Deaths are 2,222. 2,226. Case fatality rate, 0.8%. Deaths per 100,000, and that to me is the key. Deaths per 100,000, 3.2. United Kingdom, 4.9 million, as you can see, 4,920,168. Total deaths, 128,486. 2.6% death. Case fatality rate, that's, you got to be clear on that, because you may not know how many people have actually been infected, but you do know the cases. But case fatality rate, 2.6%. With deaths per 100,000, 192.25. Now, to me, the UK is something to look at for Thailand, because demographically, the numbers are not too far off. It's, there may be some differences in a lot of different things, but it's about the same size in terms of population. So when comparing, for example, to the United States, 33,717,567 with 605,526 deaths, 1.8% case fatality rate at 184.48. Well, the U.S. is a lot bigger. Now, again, the great equalizer there is deaths per 100,000, and that makes a big difference. But again, I bring this up because deaths per 100,000 in Thailand are 3.2. And yet you see the media and it's like, this is the Black Death. And I'm not saying that this disease doesn't exist. I'm not saying it doesn't kill people. I'm not saying that's not terrible. I'm not saying that precautions shouldn't be taken. But it seems that we've allowed hysteria in some instances to overtake reason is my only point. And as I said earlier regarding, like flatten the curve, well, we're 16 months in. This notion of flatten the curve, we tried that 3 or 4 times now, and the curve ain't flat, it's just a fact. And in a sense, if lockdowns work, a very valid question at this point, 16 months in, after 3 hard lockdowns, and I would argue we're kind of in a 4th sort of semi-lockdown now. If it worked, why hasn't it worked? That would be my main question on that. So moving forward, just further examples of some of this stuff, and the way the media, in my opinion, there's a sort of almost, I don't know how to put this, almost a kind of willful, I hesitate to say willful, but it's a sort of a, it's like the media seems to be boxed into kind of a strange naivete with respect to some of this. Like, for example, in a recent article, again, Bangkok Post, bangkokpost.com, article is titled "The Heavy Burden of Reopening." Just a small excerpt here. In addition to a vaccine shortage, a growing concern over vaccine efficacy is fueling doubt over virus containment. It's that term containment. Why are we operating from a position that containment is the default goal? That's just a foregone conclusion that we can, at this point, contain this. Understood, if this was in a specific small town and we knew it was only there, yeah, maybe you could contain it. But this has hit what they call, community spread. It's my understanding that the notion of containment went out the window a long time ago. As we said in another video, that horse is kind of bolted. At least it's my understanding. Meanwhile, again, folks keep going on about the Delta variant now. That's kind of the new thing, and talking about India, and again, a lot of this stuff all gets conflated without a lot of perspective. And just to try to provide some perspective, at least for my own mind, there's a recent article from Zero Hedge, zerohedge.com, and I have gotten a couple of comments burning me on this channel from time to time, saying, "Well, it's terrible. You can't, you quote Zero Hedge sometimes." Zero Hedge is a pretty good resource. I find a lot of news out there. News aggregation is quite good. There are many who have said that they tend to be kind of cynical and pessimistic. And it's not the only thing I look at, but they have a lot of content on there that can be rather useful for, trying to determine the way things are working, to try to do some research and understand what's going on. Again, Zero Hedge, zerohedge.com, article is titled "Panic Porn Dressed Up as Science, Exposing the Truth About the Delta Variant." Quoting directly, "But is the Delta variant really, quote, far more contagious than earlier iterations of SARS-CoV-2, and far more contagious is all in quotes, so far more contagious, unquote." Quoting further, "In a recent piece published by The Blaze, writer Dan Horowitz explains that the existing data suggests Delta isn't any deadlier or more infectious than other strains. Horowitz described the warnings from epidemiologists and public health bureaucrats like Dr. Fauci as, quote, panic porn dressed up as science, unquote. Quoting further, and this is quoting directly from The Blaze, "The implication from these headlines is that somehow this variant is truly more transmissible and deadly. They escape natural immunity and possibly the vaccine, and therefore, paradoxically, you must get vaccinated and continue doing all the things that failed to work for the other variants." Quoting further, if people would actually look at the data, they'd realize that the Delta variant is actually less deadly. These headlines are able to gain momentum only because of the absurd public perception that somehow India got hit worse than the rest of the world. In reality, India has 1/7 the death rate per capita of the US. It is just that India got the major winter wave later when the Western countries were largely done with it, thereby giving the illusion that India somehow suffered worse. Quoting further, fortunately, the UK government has already exposed these headlines as a lie for those willing to take notice. On June 18th, Public Health England published its 16th report on, quote, SARS-CoV-2 variants of concern and variants under investigation in England, unquote, this time grouping the variants by Greek letters. As you can see, the Delta variant has a 0.1% case fatality rate out of 31,132 Delta sequence infections confirmed by investigators. That is the same rate as the flu and is much lower than the CFR for the ancestral strain or any other variants. And as we know, the CFR is always higher than the infection fatality rate, IFR, because many of the mildest and asymptomatic infections go undocumented, while the confirmed cases tend to have a bias towards those who are more evidently symptomatic. In other words, Delta is literally the flu with a CFR identical to it. This is exactly what every respiratory pandemic has done through history, morphed into a more transmissible and less virulent form that forces the other mutations out since you get that one. So the interesting stuff here, and the reason I quoted this is I found it, and it's data-driven. It's based on this Public Health England publication from the 16th of June titled, and I quote again, SARS-CoV-2 variants of concern and variants under investigation in England. A final note in quoting this article, Senator Rand Paul has been one of the most vocal critics of the Delta variant hysteria. In a tweet sent yesterday morning, he urged the public not to let the fearmongers win. And we're quoting the tweet. We'll make sure that's up there so you can see it from Rand Paul. Don't let the fearmongers win. New Public England study of Delta variant shows 44 deaths out of 53,822, 0.8% in unvaccinated group. Now, the reason for noting Senator Rand Paul is he's not just a U.S. senator, which is obviously notable. He's also a physician. He's a board-certified physician. So anytime he starts talking about public policy related to COVID matters, obviously in the U.S. context, it gives me pause. I want to hear what he has to say. The reason I'm not necessarily making this because I think this is the end-all be-all on the science. I'm not here to say it is the end-all be-all on the science. What I'm bringing up is the fact that I haven't heard this in a lot of other publications, especially here in Thailand, that there may be something other than the sky is falling in terms of this Delta variant, for lack of a better term, narrative going around at the moment. So I just wanted to kind of put that out there to bring things into a little bit of context, because again, it just seems like, everybody's talking about, things like toilet plumes or, just sort of being very, and talking about, containment when, we're kind of going to have to get used to this, which brings me to my next article that I'm quoting here, which is from news.com.au. And we've talked about this in another video where we were quoting from the South China Morning Post about a similar situation going on. Well, it's talking about the same thing basically. But this is, and again, I bring this up to point out sort of the media's kind of, I hesitate to use the word spin, but they just sort of ever so slightly tint how these things are reported. We talked about this before. Singapore seems to be coming to a much more, in my opinion, a much more nuanced approach to dealing with COVID, rather than just, let's use a mallet to kill a fly, although I wouldn't call COVID a fly. But they're not just continuing down this, doing the same thing over and over. As they say, insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different outcome. Singapore does seem to be somewhat changing their approach, or at least they're changing their thinking on it. And we talked about this in another video, but again, to reiterate here, again, this is news.com.au. Article is titled, Singapore's Surprising New Plan to, quote, live with COVID revealed. And then the byline is, no quarantine, no icky tests, and no daily numbers. One nation that Australians know well is taking a controversial course out of the pandemic. And I thought two words were surprising in this title. First of all, Singapore's surprising new plan. And what I find interesting is I thought that this was kind of how we always dealt with public health issues, and that, frankly, the response to COVID was kind of the new plan. In fact, I urge anyone that can show me in history when entire nations' economies have been utterly shut down in response to any kind of public health issue. I mean, it didn't happen in the Spanish flu, and yes, I know there are people out there that will cite there were towns that were quarantined and things. It has happened in that context, and I have heard that it's my understanding in Australia at one point there was a 1-year quarantine for the entire continent down there at one point. Again, kind of a different scenario, but as far as the whole world just shutting down whole economies, this whole approach to this is rather unprecedented. The other thing that I thought was interesting is Australians know well is taking a controversial course out of the pandemic. Well, why is this controversial? And we'll get into it here in a minute, but why is a different approach necessarily controversial? So, quoting directly from the article, all that would eventually be done away with, and that's sort of the standard COVID response, for example, the way most countries are dealing, or certain places are dealing with it, including Thailand. But all that would be eventually done away with under the plan put out by Ministers Kong, Yong, and Wong, who make up Singapore's COVID-19 multi-ministry task force. Quoting directly from them, those three ministers, every year many people catch the flu. The overwhelming majority recover without needing to be hospitalized and with little or no medication. But a minority, especially the elderly and those with comorbidities, can get very ill and some succumb. We can't eradicate it, but we can turn the pandemic into something much less threatening, like influenza or chickenpox, and get on with our lives, the trio said. What I find really fascinating about that is from three ministers in a national government, in the Singapore government. And in that article in the byline says it's a controversial approach. Well, first of all, who's in controversy? They're the ministers in Singapore, so they're setting the policy. It just seems as though, I don't know, maybe it's just the way people kind of think. You get into a rigidity of thinking, and anything that sort of differs from that sort of orthodoxy becomes sort of controversial. To sort of sum up this video, and I'm sure anybody watching at this point might be happy for that, but the reason for this, and the reason I have made some of these videos talking about this, is because this isn't happening in a vacuum. This feedback loop, the people in the government and trying to use restrictions and these lockdown measures and all of this kind of stuff to sort of stop or contain COVID, which I think reasonable people could argue might not be possible, especially at this point, or eradicate COVID. And as the Singaporean ministers said, you can't do it. You can't eradicate it. It's just here. It's endemic. We're going to have to learn to deal with it. But in making these harsh, draconian moves, this is not happening in a vacuum. This has an impact on people's lives. And a recent article from the Bangkok Post, it's bangkokpost.com, sort of sums this up. The article is titled, Contribution of SMEs to GDP to Drop. Quoting directly, small and medium-sized enterprises, SMEs, contribution to the gross domestic product is expected to drop in the second quarter because of the harsh impact of new infections, which began in April. Wirapong Malai, Director General of the Office of Small and Medium Enterprises Promotion, OSMEP, said the agency has forecast the contribution of SMEs toward GDP to fall in the second quarter from 35% of GDP in the first quarter of this year. However, the percentage of decrease for the second quarter is not available. The pandemic was blamed for the SME's contribution toward GDP falling to 32%. And this is again where I take issue with the way this is reported. The pandemic was blamed. The pandemic didn't make legal policy. The pandemic didn't make government policy. The pandemic just exists. The reaction to it is what, for example, the closure of businesses is the direct proximate cause of the businesses being closed and therefore those businesses being unable to contribute to GDP. The pandemic didn't do it. You know, it's our reaction to the pandemic. Now, I'm not saying that the reaction's good, bad, or indifferent, but the reaction is what caused the closures, not the virus. The virus can't close anything. It can't make a government executive decree. Quoting further, GDP falling to 32% in the second quarter of 2020 before recovering to 34.5% in the fourth quarter last year. So again, this is, to just reiterate that, and I've seen that a lot, the pandemic has caused a downturn, etc. I've seen this, it's not just Bangkok Post, it's the press out there all over the place that will use that terminology. And again, I think it would be better if the media would say what's really going on. The government's policy on X has resulted in Y. And I'm not doing that to blame. I'm doing that because, or I'm not saying that, I'm not saying I'm in favor of that because I'm in favor of blaming anyone. But part of the problem in all of this has been the kind of vague, soft reporting on these things without getting into the nitty-gritty, and because we need to ascertain the threat in order to do a proper cost-benefit analysis. And sort of in closing here, we'll go ahead and put this up. This is from Twitter. It's from Dear Farang's Twitter account, at Dear Farang on Twitter. And it says, people waiting on Pattaya Beach for food handouts, hashtag amazing Thailand. And I would say amazing Thailand because Thais are trying to help each other through this. And that is a good thing. That's something I do like to see. You know, Thais helping other Thais out by, you know, helping those who are down on their luck as a result of the current situation that we are in. Now, do I want to see those folks down on their luck like that? No. And do I think that perhaps a more nuanced, reasoned response to this situation is in order? And would it help a whole lot if the media would get out of the amplifying blame business and stirring up hysteria business and maybe get more into the let's report data and information so that the people and the government can make reasoned decisions doing a cost-benefit analysis about what's best for Thailand moving forward.